There is a specific kind of pain that does not announce itself with screaming or tears. It arrives quietly, dressed in a Sunday dinner and the smell of pot roast, and it sits down at the table right next to you and waits for the moment you least expect it before it takes everything you thought you understood about your own family and turns it completely upside down. And that is exactly what happened to me on the last Sunday of March in the house I grew up in, surrounded by every person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I need you to stay with me through this entire story because what I am about to tell you is something I have never said out loud to anyone outside of the four walls of my own home. And by the time I reach the end of it, I think you will understand why. I was 28 years old. I had been with my fiance, Daniel, for 4 years, and we had set our wedding date for the following October. And for the past 3 years, every single month without fail, I had been transferring money into a joint savings account that my mother had suggested we open together when I first got engaged, because she said she wanted to contribute, she said she wanted to be part of building this day, she said that this was her way of showing me how proud she was of the woman I had become. I believed her. I transferred every spare dollar I had into that account. I skipped vacations, I packed lunches, I said no to things that my friends took for granted because I had a goal, and I had a mother who I believed was standing beside me working toward it. So when she called that Sunday and asked me to come to dinner and mentioned that the whole family would be there, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, my grandmother, I assumed it was just a regular family gathering, the kind we had every few months where someone made too much food and everyone talked too loud, and I went home feeling both exhausted and full. I had absolutely no reason to believe that anything about that evening was going to be different from any other. I sat in my usual chair, the one closest to the kitchen door, the one I had sat in since I was 7 years old, and I watched my mother move around the table with the kind of deliberate energy that I now recognize as someone who has made a decision and is trying to outrun their own nerves about it. She waited until everyone had their plates. She waited until the conversation had settled into that comfortable after-dinner hum. And then she stood up and she reached into the drawer beside the refrigerator and she pulled out a white envelope and she walked to the other end of the table where my sister Diane was sitting and she placed that envelope in front of her and put both hands on Diane's shoulders and said, "This family has always believed in betting on the right horse." I stared at that envelope and I felt something cold move through my entire body because I recognized it. Not the envelope itself, but the weight of it, the size of it, the way it sat on the table in front of my sister. And before my mother even finished her next sentence, I already knew what was inside it, and I already knew that my entire understanding of the last 3 years was about to collapse in on itself like a building with no foundation. Before I tell you what she said next, I need you to subscribe to this channel and drop your country in the comments below, because what my mother said in front of every person at that table is something I think you need to hear sitting down. My mother looked at my sister the way she had always looked at her, like she was something rare and precious that the rest of us were lucky to be in the same room with. And she said, "Diane has an opportunity in front of her that this family cannot afford to let pass, and as her mother, it is my job to make sure she has everything she needs to take it." And then she looked down the table at me, and she smiled, the kind of smile that is not really a smile at all, and she said, "Eleanor has always been the steady one, the practical one. She will be fine. She always finds a way. But Diane needs this more right now, and I know Eleanor understands that." And the entire table nodded, the way people nod when they have already been briefed before the dinner and are simply performing agreement for the benefit of the person who has not yet been told. I sat completely still. I did not pick up my fork. I did not reach for my glass. I just looked at my mother, and I waited for her to say something that would make this make sense, something that would reframe what I was hearing into something other than what it so clearly was. But she did not say anything else. She simply sat back down and picked up her own fork like she had just announced a change in the seating arrangement rather than the complete dismantling of 3 years of my life. It was my Aunt Carol who finally broke the silence at my end of the table, leaning over with that particular brand of sympathy that people offer when they feel guilty for not stopping something. And she patted my hand and said, "You're so strong, Eleanor. You'll figure it out. You always do." And I remember thinking that being called strong by the people who are counting on your strength to excuse their own silence is one of the loneliest feelings a person can experience. I excused myself from the table. I walked to the bathroom at the end of the hall, the one with the broken towel rack that my father had been meaning to fix for 11 years, and I sat on the edge of the bathtub, and I did something I had not done in a very long time. I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel every single thing I was feeling. The betrayal, the humiliation, the grief of realizing that the woman who raised me had looked at both of her daughters and made a calculation, and I was the one that came out worthless. I gave myself those 5 minutes, and then I washed my face, and I looked in the mirror, and I made a decision. Because here is what my mother did not know. Here is what nobody at that dinner table knew. 3 years of watching my money disappear into that joint account had taught me one very important thing about my mother's name being on it alongside mine. And 2 weeks before that Sunday dinner, something had made me sit down with a financial advisor, a woman named Sandra, who had a small office above the pharmacy on Clement Street. And what Sandra had told me in that meeting had led me to make a move that very same afternoon that I had not told a single person about. Not Daniel, not my closest friend, not anyone, because some decisions are made in silence and protected in silence until the moment arrives when silence is no longer necessary. I walked back to that dinner table. I sat down in my chair. I picked up my fork, and I looked at my mother across the length of that table, and I said, "You're right, Mom. I'll be fine." And I meant it in a way that she would not understand for exactly 30 days. 30 days is not a long time in the life of a family, but it is long enough for the truth to find its way to the surface. And on the 31st day after that Sunday dinner, my mother called me at 8 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, and her voice had a quality to it that I had never heard before. Not anger, not guilt, but something closer to disorientation, like a person who has walked into a room they thought they knew and found all the furniture rearranged in the dark. She said, "Eleanor, I need you to explain something to me." And I sat down with my coffee and I said, "Of course, Mom. What is it?" And she said, "I went to the bank yesterday to make a deposit into the account, and the woman at the counter told me the account had been closed, and I told her that was impossible, and she showed me the paperwork, and Eleanor, there is a withdrawal date on this paperwork that is 2 weeks before the dinner, and I need you to tell me that this is some kind of mistake." I let the silence sit between us for a moment, not to be cruel, but because I wanted to make sure that when I spoke, the words were exactly right. And then I said, "It's not a mistake, Mom." And I heard her breath catch on the other end of the line. What Sandra had told me in that meeting above the pharmacy on Clement Street was something that I suspect my mother had never considered possible, that a joint account, under the right circumstances and with the right documentation, could be closed and its full contents transferred by either account holder, and that as long as the proper steps were followed, there was nothing the other account holder could do to reverse it once it was done. So, 2 weeks before that Sunday dinner, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I had walked into that bank, I had sat down with a very patient account manager named Thomas, and I had transferred every single dollar of that money. Every dollar I had earned, every dollar I had sacrificed for, every dollar I had protected through 3 years of packed lunches and skipped vacations into a brand new individual account that had only one name on it, and that name was mine. My mother was silent for so long that I checked the phone to see if the call had dropped. And then she said, "Eleanor, that money was for both of us to manage." And I said, "No, Mom, that money was mine. I earned it, I saved it, and I protected it. And the only thing I did not do was tell you I was doing it, which I now realize was the right decision." She started to say something about Diane, about the opportunity, about the family, and I let her finish, and when she was done, I said something that I had been quietly preparing for 30 days. I said, "Mom, You stood up at that table in front of everyone we love, and you told me I didn't have a bright future. And then you tried to give away the money I had worked for 3 years to save. And I sat there, and I smiled, and I said I would be fine, and I meant it, because I had already made sure of it. She did not respond to that. The call ended shortly after, and for 3 days, the family group chat was completely silent in a way it had never been before. It was my grandmother who reached out first, on the 4th day, not to take sides, but to ask if I was okay, and I told her I was better than okay. I told her that Daniel and I had already booked the venue, that the deposit had been paid from the account that was now entirely mine, and that the wedding was happening in October exactly as planned. My grandmother laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and honest, and she said, "Good girl." My mother and I have spoken since then, carefully, slowly, in the way that people speak when they are rebuilding something that was damaged by their own hands. Diane's opportunity, as it turned out, was a business idea that lasted 4 months before it quietly dissolved, and the money my mother had given her was gone with it. I do not say that with satisfaction. I say it because I think it matters that the universe sometimes has a way of making the accounting balance out. Not always, not for everyone, but sometimes for the people who are patient enough to let it. My wedding was everything I had planned it to be. The venue, the flowers, the dress, the man standing at the end of the aisle who had never once made me feel like I was worth less than anyone else in the room. And when my mother walked in that day and saw what I had built entirely on my own terms, she cried. And I chose to believe that somewhere inside those tears was the thing she had never quite managed to say to me at that dinner table, that I was enough, that I had always been enough, and that some lessons arrive too late to undo the damage, but just in time to prevent more of it. I am Eleanor Hayes. I paid for my own wedding, and I would do every single thing the same way again.